Bonjour tout le monde. Alors,
Hello, everyone. We'll be ending this series of lectures on unsupervised learning. This is
qui a permis de
a topic that has revived a taste for deep learning in the middle of the years 2000. Neural networks had fallen out of date, as you know. At the start of, at around 2003, 2004, a group of us, Jeff Reckenton and Benjo from the Institute of Montreal and myself, decided to form a working group remotely, financed by Canadian Foundation, to revive an interest of the community in machine learning and computer vision with respect to deep learning. The methods we focused on at the time, let's say from 2003 to 2009, were methods based on unsupervised learning. We thought the solution to the problem of learning very deep networks was due to the ability to pre-train in an unsupervised manner to have a good starting point for supervised training afterwards. So we focused a lot on that with many different techniques. The restricted Boltzmann machines, sparse autoencoders, and many other techniques that I'll be mentioning during this lecture. There were some successes, a few articles that left a mark in 2007 up to 2008. What happened afterwards? Well, these methods, we showed that through unsupervised learning on small databases, we could improve performances significantly as compared to pure supervised learning, because with small databases, if you use pure supervised learning, there are problems with overfitting, overparameterization. When the vision databases typically contain just a few million examples, training a large convolutional network didn't work. So we had to think about unsupervised learning techniques, and we realized towards the end of, at around 2008 or 2009, that for databases, that even for relatively small databases, what was important was not only unsupervised learning, but more particularly, the type of non-linearity used in the networks. We quickly realized that with rectifications in networks instead of sigmoids, as we normally did, with rectifications and with back propagation, quite simply, we could train relatively deep networks, and performance even on small trampling samples worked far better. Just by changing the sigmoid in the rectification, the performance on lower-end databases, for example, would double. The precision would increase by from 30%, which is poor, to reach up to 60% or 65% by adding unsupervised learning, which at the time was not far from state-of-the-art. What happened afterwards was that the large databases such as ImageNet and the like appeared. We already had that for speech recognition. We realized that we really didn't need prior unsupervised learning. If we had large databases, we could train deep networks by using backpropagation. So we stepped back and we said that it's not that interesting with supervised learning. But now it's coming back because of a strong argument, namely that over the long term, it is quite clear that supervised learning is necessary. I will present the reasons for that in detail. The first part of my lecture will be the reasons why. What are the next steps to make progress in artificial intelligence? It's my personal vision, but that calls for unsupervised learning. But I will define that. And then I will describe techniques developed in the middle of at around 2005 for unsupervised learning of deep networks. And next week I'll speak about promising techniques such as adversarial training. In the second part of our day, we'll have Rob Fergus, who is here, will give you a lecture in English, and he will be speaking in detail about some of the models I mentioned last week. models using memory, for example.
Alors, quels sont les obstacles?
So what are the obstacles of progress in artificial intelligence, and why do we need unsupervised learning? There are three main obstacles for progress in artificial intelligence. First of all, integrating deep learning with reasoning, attention, and memory, which we spoke about last week, and Rob will be speaking about in the next seminar. Secondly, integrating supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning. All three learnings are three facets of a common problem that we can try to model in a unified way. There are some algorithms that we know, such as Boltzmann machines, that are neither supervised nor unsupervised. Well, they're one or the other, depending on how you use them. The algorithm itself does not contain in its construction the fact that it's supervised or not. It depends on how it is used. Intuitively, I believe it would be good to have such algorithms that make no difference between both, and there's no difference in nature between both. And I'll be highlighting the differences. But what we need are effective ways to do unsupervised learning. For the time being, animals and human beings are very efficient at unsupervised learning, and we have nothing similar for machines. I think this is the main obstacle in artificial intelligence when the media tells us, or when you hear statements by some startups, that we're very close to solving the problem of artificial intelligence and soon we'll have robots as intelligent as human beings. I think that's not true until we solve this problem, and we have not. I do not believe that we'll be able to build really intelligent machines before that. This is not the only obstacle, it's the next obstacle. But there may be other mountains behind that that we do not see as yet. I will try to define my personal definitions that are not necessarily shared by the community, but I'll try to define what I mean by reinforcement, supervised and unsupervised learning. Reinforcement learning. It is a situation with the machine at each sample or test or trial or from time to time. How do I say this? It gives a scalar value, which is an assessment of its performance. You must consider the machine with its environment. If the environment is a part of the object you're modeling, the information going from the environment to the machine is scalar, a scalar from time to time or at each trial. There are some aspects of unsupervised learning. One aspect is that the scalar comes from the environment, but it's not a function that you can differentiate. You can't do a gradient descent. You must try several actions to see the scalar rewarded, that it returns, the reinforcement, the reward that the environment sends. And from there on, you can change the way you produce actions. In other words, a policy. So as to improve the mean score. This form of learning, unfortunately, is extremely slow and calls for a lot of samples. The reason being that if the environment gives you only a scalar from time to time, in terms of information, there's very little information given to the system to set constraints and parameters. So if you have a machine with a huge number of parameters, let's say a small animal's brain is already billions or billions of billions for human beings in their brain. There is no way to set constraints for such a large number of parameters if the number of trials goes through the environment and you receive a reward from time to time or something positive or negative. Mathematically, it is impossible to train a machine that way. The environment must give far more information to the machine, or the machine must exploit far more information from the environment. This is why the success of reinforcement learning, such as with AlphaGo recently, or the DeepMind system playing Atari, this is why they work. They work on games, and in games you can simulate the environment quickly. You can therefore artificially produce a lot of samples, and you can get a lot of feedback information. so that you can train efficiently for reinforcement learning. But to use it in real-life world is far more complicated. To train a robot, for example, the environment runs at its own pace, and from time to time you get a reinforcement, or a positive or negative, a reward. But it doesn't go quickly enough. You can't train a large system like that. That is impossible. One alternative to this is not having a single individual, but having hundreds of millions of individuals in parallel who learn, and then you get a lot of reinforcement. This technique is used by internet companies like Google. They use this type of technique. All companies, in fact, showing ads on the internet use this technique to find out which ad to show to people. You show an ad, you see if people click, and that's a reinforcement. And since you have hundreds of millions or billions of users, you have enough signals to train even a complicated system. The second form is supervised. Supervised learning gives far more information to the system than reinforcement learning. Because when you tell the machine, here's the desired output, what I should say about reinforcement learning is that it's a bit similar to the situation we use to train a pet, a dog, or a circus animal. You wait for the animal to do the action properly and you give it a reward. It's very slow. You must lead the animal to carry out the action properly. If it's at random and if you have many possible actions, learning can then be very slow. Supervised learning is more a situation that we are familiar with. We spoke about this during the previous lectures. A situation that is similar in the real life to showing a picture book to a young child and saying the name of the animals in the picture book. You give far more information to the machine then because you tell the machine. Well, for each example, you give constraints as to the value of the rewards, the loss function, for each possible value of the output. If you tell the machine or the child it's a giraffe, implicitly you're saying it's not an elephant, it's not a dog, it's not a car, it's not a table. So you're giving a lot of information to the machine. You're giving a value vector by saying this is a giraffe and not something else. Each example gives far more information to the machine, and this is why we can have very powerful machines with just tens of thousands of samples, depending on the size of the machine. But nevertheless, this is limited. What you can do with supervised learning today is to enable the machine to learn enough information to learn common sense, how the world operates. For example, that's the role of unsupervised learning. In unsupervised learning, the basic idea is to ask the machine to predict a lot of variables, and these variables are in a way unreliable. You don't assume that the variables are given to the machine by an intelligent entity. They're just there in data. For example, you make the machine observe as frames in a video and you ask the machine to predict the future frame, or you conceal the left side of the picture and you ask the machine to reconstruct it. You can do that as a human being. Our brains are predicting machines in a way. One striking example is that we have a part of our visual field is blind, where we can't see, but you don't realize it because the brain fills in the missing information. So this is predicting. If I were to take a pen and put it on the table, and if I let it go, you can predict probably that it will fall. Not in which direction, but you can predict that it will fall. So the ability to predict what will happen in the environment is what intelligence is all about, really. This is what enables you to survive or to extract information or energy from the environment. This is probably the only way we can train huge models with billions and billions of parameters. It's the only one that forces the model to predict in high dimensions, exploiting the huge amount of information produced by the environment just through observation. These are the main reasons for supervised learning. This is my personal view, not necessarily shared by everyone in the scientific community, especially not by my colleagues at Facebook. We all have different opinions about the important problems to be solved, to solve problems as regards artificial intelligence. It's not a dogma, but this is an avenue to be explored. This will lead to this analogy in the form of a joke, let's say. I spoke about this in my inaugural lesson. If intelligence were a chocolate cake, let's say a black forest, I believe in this case, the cake itself, the genoise in the cake, is unsupervised learning. The icing on the cake, that's supervised learning, and the cherry on the cake is reinforcement learning. And the size of these different components corresponds to the amount of information given to the machine by the environment and the machine's ability to exploit it. The big problem, though, is that if it's really the essence of intelligence, we can do the cherry or icing, but we can't do the cake. We can't make the cake. So far, we have no way, no comprehensive way to carry out unsupervised learning. With this, I'll spend the next 2 hours giving you a list of methods. These are methods that are good ideas. They work in some cases, but they're not the ultimate solution, and the ultimate solution will probably be an abstraction of some of these methods. This will lead me to say that unsupervised learning is the dark matter, or the dark energy of learning. Like for physicists, for whom 95% of the mass of the universe is unknown, a bit embarrassing for physicists. The same thing for us in artificial intelligence, in machine learning. 95%, well, more or less, it's not an exact figure, of course, but let's say that the vast majority of learning is unknown. We can only do simple things for the time being. It's the main reason why we still have a far way to go before we can get to human-level intelligent machines. But there are other people in the community who believe that it's more a matter of reinforcement learning, or maybe they have a different definition from what I presented of reinforcement learning, and that's a bit more general. So we learn a lot of things as human beings and animals by living in the environment. We learn the physical constraints of the world. We learn many things about the nature of the world that seem obvious to us if you're not fully aware of it. But it's a huge amount of information that we learn simply by observation or by predicting, by training our brain to predict what will happen in the future, or to fill in the blanks, the missing data, or it's known what a person will look like when you see them full face versus a profile picture. For example, we learn that the world is three-dimensional, that objects can move independently of each other, and we learn that some objects are in front of others and can hide them. And as I said the last time, the fact that objects do not disappear when they are hidden. This is something you learn as a baby. Young babies do not have a notion that an object still exists when it is hidden. So this is why playing peekaboo is so funny. This is not reserved for humans. The same for animals. Here's an example of a magic trick shown to an orangutan, where the content of the box is removed without the monkey realizing it, and it makes it laugh. So violating common sense generates humor, or things that are unusual, things that we like. that are the source of humor, art, the interesting things in the world. We lend attention to things that violate our model of the world and that encourage us to be more attentive. Some people even made this a basic principle. The characteristics extracted by the brain are based on differences between what's happening in the world and what the brain predicted. This is what allows us to lend attention to surprising things. To give us an idea about what we mean by common sense, if I say, let me take Bernard Chokov, who was in the room when I gave this presentation the first time. If I say Bernard picks up his bag and leaves the room, you can infer many different scenarios of what will happen because you know the constraints of this physical world. You know that Bernard is probably a person, maybe an orang-utan, but probably a person. He'll probably stand up, extend his arm to get his bag, open his hand, take his bag. He won't fly. He won't dematerialize like that guy over there. He'll probably open the door, go through the door. There are many things, a lot of information, very rich information that you can infer from this sentence. You can fill in the gaps of missing information because you know the constraints of the physical world. And this is what is known as common sense. There's no machine that can do this. The only example, well, maybe not the only example, but one attempt at trying to instill common sense in machines was the example I spoke of last week. Training a memory network in Q&As to answer questions after describing an action carried out by characters in a sort of textual character game. It's a sort of simulator of the environment with the machine as the predictor of that environment, and the machine is augmented by a system that can convert a textual description into a sequence of actions in the environment and then answer questions by observing the current state of the environment. This is a small attempt at this, but very restricted. Now, unsupervised learning, in general terms, but rather conventionally. So how do we do unsupervised learning? Some of us have a fast instinct which consists in saying that unsupervised learning, if you want to do predictive learning, let's say, or to predict a part of the input based on another part that you observed, of course, the world is not strictly predictable. There's not one single correct prediction. What I showed you earlier with the pen that I drop, there's no correct answer as to where the pen will fall. There are many correct answers corresponding to all the possible angles at which it can fall. It is far enough, and your visual system is limited enough so as not to perceive the bias on the pen. So it's hard to predict what side it will fall. You know it will fall, and in one of these predictions, if you predict that it will fall on this side, but it falls like this, you were right nevertheless, despite the fact that the world does not agree with you. But you're right in that prediction. The question is, how do you teach a machine where what you observe in the world are examples of a set of possible futures? And how can you avoid making the machine making the wrong prediction? But that was possible. The crucial problem with unsupervised learning is there, and this is my personal view. You may say that it's easy. The future state of the world is not a point, but it's a distribution of probabilities or density in continuous state. The problem is that we don't know how to represent distributions in high-dimensional spaces. If I were to say predict the next frame in the video, is a very high-dimension continuous space, and we can't represent complex distributions in these spaces. Maybe we should try to reduce our ambitions. Instead of trying to predict a distribution, predict all the possibilities. Let's call the varieties or manifolds without trying to predict a distribution. There are many methods proposed that I will not cover, or not a lot, using what we call sampling methods. If you have a large, complicated distribution in high-dimensional spaces, the way you manipulate them based on a collection of samples, its distribution, therefore. There are many machines like restricted Boltzmann machines or autoencoders using sampling. I don't believe in that. This is my personal opinion, because these sampling methods cannot be scaled up. If you want to sample in high-dimension spaces, your sampling is very sparse, diluted, so you withdraw very little information. It will call for a huge amount of information to characterize a surface in high-dimensional space. That makes me allergical in a way. It gives me goosebumps. I'm exaggerating a bit, of course. I use it when necessary. There are very useful methods for this. So this is the problem. We have observations. The X's, we have a machine that will predict Y's. Y bar is a prediction of the future, where a part of X that was not observed, so this may be the next frame in a video, or the left part of a video without seeing the right, whereas you only saw the right part, or your left profile versus your right profile. So it captures data regularity. What the machine must predict is a manifold, not a point. The machine will produce a point, but this point represents a manifold of a surface, or several surfaces, or a distribution. Well, let's see a manifold. It is highly possible that in our database at this point in time, the learning set we receive is this. It will be different. What you must tell the machine is that this is the pen falls to the left. Here the pen falls in a different direction. And the machine shouldn't predict a point on the surface, but not on the surface. The problem is that you don't know the surface. The surface is characterized by the world's invariants, the irregularities in the world. So you need to learn this surface at the same time as you learn this. And this is what makes the problem complex. Here we have another variable, Z, which may be a latent or hidden variable that can be simple in distribution, or it may be retrieved on a relatively simple flat surface. When you vary it, the position of the output may vary on this surface. This is a sort of parameterization of this output surface. But this variable is not necessarily present. Here is a particular example. How can we formalize this in mathematical terms, or more conceptually? Not with formulae, but relatively simply. Let's imagine a very simple world with a variable x observed, but let's ignore that for the time being, and we must predict two variables, y1 and y2. In our database for x, which we observed, the two variables, y1 and y2, are distributed like this. So a clear dependency between y1 and y2. This is a sort of parabola, so there may be a relationship such as y2 equals y1 squared, more or less, with noise. So here are the observations of the world. How can we train a machine so that when you observe only y1, you can predict y2, or observe y2 and predict y1, or when you observe a constraint on one variable, you can predict a constraint on the other variable? What we can do is train a machine to produce a contrast function. The question here is, how do you train the function that will tell you if you are on the manifold or not on the surface? We can model that using a contrast or an energy function. I call this an energy function because it's very similar. In mathematics, you can use this. It's like a notion of energy in statistical physics. I'll come back to that later on. But this is the characterization of an energy function. Here are the points observed, y1, y2. We don't know which is observed and which is not. Maybe none of the two variables is observed. We need to learn a function. Let's say a function f, let's call it f, that takes a point in space and tells us if this point in space is on the surface of the data observed, and giving us low values when the point is on the surface observed and higher values when it's outside. There are several solutions to this problem. I tried two energy functions which are both correct, taking value 0 if you're on the surface or higher values if you're not on the surface. The problem with learning here is to give the right shape to this energy function so that you get low values for the things observed. It's very similar to a situation I described in energy-based supervised learning. The same formalism. We don't necessarily need to have observed variables x. If you have an energy function like this, it can be transformed into a probability distribution if you wish, by taking exponential minus the energy function and multiplying by a parameter, which may be assimilated to inverse temperature in physics. This is what we know as the Gibbs distribution. And you normalize, summing up all the values of y of the term at the top. If you integrate this ratio with respect to y, you obtain 1, giving you a normalized distribution on y. But this integral is not necessarily convergent. For example, if you take, this function is probably convergent when you take the sum of exponentials. It's a sort of parabola. At any rate, when you take, if you know y1, this one is certainly not convergent because the energy function saturates to the integral on the complete domain. We can't, it's not always something that exists, and we can't always calculate it because very often this integral is totally intractable, and we can't transform this energy into probabilities. This is why I have been thinking for some time now, including for supervised learning, that we must be wary of probabilities. Probabilities restrict us to a certain type of lost function that is not necessarily tractable. It allows us to carry out calculations without thinking, but it may be dangerous, limiting the type of energy function or loss function and things of that sort that we can use. So I prefer a parameterization of all this in the form of energy, which is, in a way, more fundamental than the probability that may be derived from this, and it is certainly more general. Here is an example of a relatively simple learning algorithm that can change the shape of its energy function so that it takes on the right shape. This is an energy function parameterized so that the energy function is composed of a series of shapes of V shapes with respect to y2, and we can change the minimum of V to align them with these points. This works for a parabola in this direction, but not with several possible values of y2 for a single value of y1, because there is only one minimum of the function in the direction y2. Here is a more general parameterization of the energy function, a sort of a flexible leaf. The way you train the system, when you have a learning point, you adjust the energy function so that the parameters, so that the energy is at the lowest point possible. You take other points at random around it, and they're higher up. You maximize their energy in a way. If you do this sufficiently often with a reasonable loss function, you end up with an energy function with the right shape. But there's a simple problem. Take a point and make a gradient step so that the energy function descends to that point with respect to the parameter. You adjust the parameters so that the energy given to that point descends or is as small as possible. That's possible. Just calculate a gradient and change the parameters. The problem is how do you make energy of the points outside, the points that are not a part of the learning manifold. How can you guarantee that the energy is higher for those points? There are many points outside. This is a high-dimensional space, so you'll have to be very clever in how you produce this, or use roundabout means to make sure that the function takes on the right shape. I listed about 8 strategies for unsupervised learning.
Et il y a une excuse que je dois faire.
I must make an apology. I should have explained this and written it in an article that I've never written. So they're here on this slide. The first method consists in building a machine so that the volume of space that can take low energy is limited. This is what you do when you use probabilistic methods. They insist for distribution of probabilities to be normalized. If you give a high probability to one point in space, you'll have to give a low one to other points in space through normalization. But as I said before, normalization is very often very complicated. There's another method that works similarly. For example, the principal component analysis, K-means, Gaussian mixture model, independent component analysis. All of these have terms whose loss function or the nature of the model is such that the volume of space that can take on low energy is limited. I will give you a few examples later on to give you a feeling about this. There's another method that I just described, which consists in pushing down on the points coming from the learning manifold to make sure that the energy is low. And elsewhere you push upwards, the points that are outside. And then you have maximum likelihood and similar methods that do this. But they need a tractable partition function, the normalization term, that is, and that's not always the case. In interesting models, this is almost never the case. What you can also do is to push down the energy of data points and push up, not on all the points outside, but a small subsets of well-chosen points. There are many methods for this: contrastive divergence, ratio matching, noise contrastive estimation, minimum probability flow. I won't go into the details, but let me give you an example. For noise constructive, that is used for the restricted Boltzmann machine. You take a data point, that data point you change the parameters of the energy function for its energy to descend, but at the same time I give a fishnet, a sort of a ball, and I simulate that ball descending in the energy landscape, so to speak, over a period. What will happen is that ball with a high probability will have a lower energy level, but probably not on the data surface if it doesn't have the right form. If the energy has the right shape, it will stay. If it's not, it will stay in a sort of energy minimum if you run the simulation long enough, but not on the manifold. But because of the initial pitch net, it can increase its energy to find minima on the other side of the mountain, maybe. This pitch net technique and simulations, this is what you call hybrid Monte Carlo. There are other names for this technique. This was studied by Radford Neal at the University of Toronto. So we simulate this pool ball on a continuous space, and then we have a point, and we'll push the energy upwards. If we do that often enough, each time you push energy 1 point down, you push energy up. What happens on the sides that locally, around the data surface, the energy function will take on the right shape. There will be a hollow dug at the data point, and the function will increase around it in a way.
Alors, il y a une idée un petit peu similaire.
A similar idea
Qui est assez séduisante, mais
that's quite appealing, but doesn't work in actual fact because it can only be applied to very simple models, but it's funny to look at. This is score matching, and this was developed in Finland within the context of independent component analysis. The idea is quite funny. You take the energy function at a data point, and you see to it that the derivative of this energy with respect to the input vector, not the parameters, is 0. So energy is a minimum or maybe a maximum or a saddle point at that point, and you make sure that the trace of your Hessian, the sum of second derivatives in all directions, is as large as possible. You make sure that the energy function is around the points, forming like grooves in the energy surface. And energy is higher around the points. That doesn't set constraints for the function's shape at a large distance from the initial points. It is extremely local with this method. It's not convenient, though, because then you'd have to calculate the gradient of the trace of the Hessian of energy with respect to the parameters. And that's horrible. It is horrible. A very interesting idea, based on ideas I developed in the 80s for my thesis, and that were reinvented by Pascal Vincent, more formally, and Yoshua Benjo at the Yoshua Benjo Institute at the University of Montreal. This is the denoise autoencoder principle, not building an energy function but a vector field, so that the vector field corresponds to an approximation of gradient of energy. The way you build the vector is that you take a point, a data point from your learning set. You add noise, sampling methods in a way. So you move in a random direction, maybe over a large distance in space, to move away from the data point. And then you train a neural network or any model, a function. You train it to transform that point to which you added noise into the original point. You train a function whose input is the noisy point and the desired output is the original point. What you're training is a function that calculates a vector field. It gives you the target of the point, and you train it so that the target of that point is on the data surface. And the result is that today we have a function characterizing the location of the data. If you give a point and the machine says the output is different, that means that you're not on the data surface. But if you give a point on the data surface, it won't move. That will give you an indication that we are in the right direction. So we have a contrast function characterizing this surface. This is a workaround way. There are connections with contrastive analyses because you have sampling and noisy data. One of my favorite methods that I will speak about for the next 15 minutes is linked to regularization methods, limiting the volume of space in low energy. You take a model. You want the energy function to be a sum of two terms. One term saying, well, which is a sort of reconstruction term, telling you, here is the point, or reconstruct the point, a sort of reconstruction error. Another term will try to force the system to minimize the volume of the input space that can take on low energy. This is what is done with sparse coding, in particular, or with sparse autoencoders. I will skip number 7, which is very much linked to autoencoders. The last one that I will speak about next week is adversarial training. And let me see, in French, I can't remember exactly how to say that. Anyway, the idea is to generate these points outside of the data manifold and have them generated by a trained neural network. In other words, you have a neural network producing the points outside the data manifold, and you will use that, or you push the energy upwards, and you reuse it to train our contrast function characterizing the surface. And then that gives you a trainable system to produce points to train the discriminator, the contrast function. The way it's done, invented by Ian Goodfellow, a student with Shebenjo a few years ago. Until recently, he was at Google and now is at OpenAI. An interesting and revolutionary idea, I believe. But I will speak about that next week. Let me start by viewing energy functions. Technique number one, build a machine so that the volume of low energy stuff is constant or weak. Here is what happens for principal component analysis in this context. We have a vector y. We project vector y on a linear subspace with a linear projection, which is the principal component. You reconstruct it with the transpose of this matrix, and you calculate the square root of the distance and the original point, giving you a distance and an energy function of this sort. In gray, this is the energy height. Black is 0, and white, high values. So if the points here are sampled along this spiral, the main component in 2 dimensions is here. So here the volume of stuff that can take on low energy is limited in dimension 1. We decided that we would have a projection only on dimension 1. So a very poor approximation of this spiral, since it is a linear approximation, doesn't work well. K-means is similar, but we have latent variables. The energy function is defined as the minimum with respect to a latent variable z of an energy function. You then calculate a square distance between a reconstruction and the data point, and this reconstruction is a multiplication of vector z by matrix W. The W columns are prototypes of k-means in clustering. I won't explain k-means. If anyone doesn't know, well, I'm sorry for you, but I can't spend time on that, on k-means. So just to enlighten those who have already seen things like this. And the vector z is forced to be a place vector, or where one component equals 1 and all the other components equal 0. So z is like this. You minimize with respect to z this distance, and the energy now, if you are close to a particular prototype, you have a quadratic distance increasing with distance. In other words, as y moves away from the closest prototype in the W column chosen, the arrow increases quadratically, a sort of quadratic well. As you come closer to another prototype, z changes, and you end up in a different parabola, a sort of minimum of multiple parabola, all centered on a prototype. This approximates this surface very well. It works in low dimensions because if you need to put points everywhere, it doesn't work well in high dimensions. We need lots of points. So k-means doesn't work very well in high dimensions. And now the question is, what if you were to make a model like this? You need to know which objective function to minimize to train the energy function and to have the right shape. So now we have 2 functions. During inference, when you set a point, after learning, set a point for the machine, you use the energy function, telling you if you are close to the data zone. But during learning, you must minimize the objective function, giving the right shape to the energy function. According to likelihood, the objective function would be minimizing, let's say, minus the log of the likelihood that our model gives to data. You can model this likelihood based on a Gibbs distribution. You give low energy to the point observed in data, so that this quantity is as high as possible. So energy must be as low as possible because of this minus. Furthermore, this amount must be as small as possible, guaranteeing normalization of distribution. If you calculate the gradient of this function with respect to, well, first, if you take minus the log of this function to transform it into a loss function, the maximum likelihood But minimizing minus the log, you obtain a function like this divided by beta, but that changes nothing. I minimize the loss function like this for a training point y, minimizing the energy of this point y, and minimizing another term. And what this other term does, the energy here of all points intervene with a minus, all of these energies will be pushed upwards so as to make this term as small as possible. So the effect will be, if you have a data point here, you push downwards the energy here, and you push upwards all the terms of all energy in this integral. We can't always calculate this integral. We can do it via Monte Carlo approximations and variational methods, lots of methods that are very pretty, but very often they don't work very well in high dimensions. So you must be careful. Don't be hypnotized with the beauty of mathematics to the price of the practical side of things. But there are many articles written on this, and not only in the context of unsupervised learning. For learning, just calculate a gradient. You calculate the gradient of this loss function, which is the gradient of the energy function, the point y with respect to the parameter of the energy function. We can calculate that. It's an energy function in a new world zone. We can do a back propagation, no problem. But once we have done all the maths, we obtain a gradient which is equal to integral on all the y's of the likelihood that our model gives to this y. We can calculate this. This is exponential minus beta of energy divided by normalization. We can calculate this if we know how to normalize, times the gradient of the energy function at this point. So this is a sort of, how would I put this, expectation. It's the integral with respect to a distribution of the gradient. Expectation of the gradient of the likelihood calculated by our model for all points. We can do this only if we know how to calculate an integral. The method invented by physicists to replace this integral by discrete sum, this is what we call the Monte Carlo method. There are other methods invented by physicists and refined by other persons in machine learning, where you say that I can't really calculate this likelihood because it's too complicated, so I'll approximate it via likelihood of which I know how to calculate the normalization term, and I'll see to it that this other substitutive likelihood is as close as possible to the real one in terms of the distance. This is what we call variational methods. I won't go into the details, but briefly, that's the basic idea. So limited applications, but for likelihood, that's what you need to do. Contrastive, I explained that a bit. Now, sparse coding. Let me now move on to this. A method that I like, in fact, and it turned out to be quite good in some cases. The idea of sparse coding is all about approximating the surface of low energy, the data surface, by a union of points. You'll have plans, low dimensional planes, lower dimension than the data surface itself, than the surface in question, and you approximate this by a union of planes. Each plane will make a contribution, a quadratic contribution to energy. When you move from the plane, you pay for it quadratically. Furthermore, you do a minimum on all these planes. So it's quite simple. From a formal standpoint, here's how we can model this. We have an input variable. Here I'm using a notation that corresponds to graph factors, to factor graphs, graphical models. Bayesian networks are an example. This is a undirected method. Here's the input variable, a possible latent variable, like in k-means or something like that. In sparse coding, to take this latent variable, you send it to a decoder, which is just a function. In the simplest case, it's just a linear, a multiplication by a matrix. And you calculate the Euclidean distance between the data point and what comes out of the decoder. It's a generative model reconstructing the input. But you set a constraint on this variable so that the variable cannot take all possible combinations of a vector. For example, it's forced to have a limited number of variables at 0, or you set a constraint for low dimensions. That's the case of ACP. Or there are other constraints. A constraint is a binary code with zeros and only one. That's the case for k-means. There are lots of other ways that can be applied for factor graphs. The inference algorithm is find the z, minimizing the distance between the input vector and the result from the decoder, plus this regularization term. Sparse coding is a specific implementation of this, where energy is the sum of these two terms. The decoder is linear, reconstruction energy is quadratic, and the regularization term is just the norm L1 of z, the sum of absolute values of the components of z multiplied by the appropriate coefficient. This system will try to reconstruct the input from a linear combination of columns of WD meaning a dictionary matrix or a decoder. So a linear combination of a small number of columns of WD. These columns correspond to the coefficient of z, which is different from 0. This term tries to minimize the number of components of z that are different from 0. This energy is relatively easy to minimize with respect to z. If I give you an y and ask you the z minimizing energy, it's quite easy. There are algorithms for that. One is called ISTA, meaning iterative shrinkage thresholding algorithm. There's an essential paper by Olshausen and Field, neuroscientists, theoretical neuroscientists. Bruno Olshausen is at Berkeley. The idea is to train this dictionary matrix. This formula has been known for years in signal processing, in applied maths, and was studied by people like Stefan Meyer. Basis pursuits and other methods are used for this. But he assumed that the columns of this matrix of WD was given a priori, with thumbnails, things of that sort. What Olshausen and Field proposes to train this dictionary matrix by a gradient descent. You take an example y, you calculate the z, minimizing this energy, giving you a y and a z. You adjust this matrix WD via gradient step stochastically to minimize the quadratic cost. If you do just that, it won't work, because after a while WD becomes extremely large and z very small, so as to minimize this and it explodes. So you limit the columns of WD inside a sphere. So you set constraints for the columns of WD to have a norm below 1. And you do a gradient descent. With each gradient step, you renormalize WD columns. With this little algorithm, it works extremely well. I will speak about this a bit later on. For example, if you apply this to MNIST, here MNIST, the input is a vector representing an image. Well, these are pixels, but let's say it represents an image. The columns of WD end up by being small bits of lines, so that through an assembly, with a weighted sum of a small number of these lines, we can reconstruct any figure. In a way, it's like finding the atoms that compose a data manifold so as to reconstruct by composition any vector of a small number of data linearly. So we take it 12 by 12, natural images, and we train. Well, the algorithm is a bit different. Predictive sparse decomposition, which I'll speak about next week. But the results are practically the same. So we start with random WD columns, and quickly, in a few iterations, the system specializes and finds detectors of oriented edges, indicating a small image patch can be represented by a linear combination of a small number of oriented edges. So it will take the thumbnail spontaneously. I will now give the floor to Rob Fergus, and I'll tell you more about this next week. Next week, The first hour will focus on unsupervised learning, adversarial training in particular, and other such variations. I'll take maybe an hour and 15 minutes, and then we'll have a session of about 4 to 5 minutes of open questions. I urge you to go on the internet, on Facebook. I have a page for this lecture, and you can put your questions there on Facebook. That way I can get ready for the complicated questions. Otherwise, you can just put your questions freely. We'll have a Q&A session for the last lecture next week. So thank you, and I'll now give the floor to Rob Fergus.